One of the most confusing aspects of avoidant behavior is that their distance often means the opposite of what it appears. When they pull away, when they seem detached, it's often because they're thinking about you constantly and can't handle the intensity. The distance is a defense against the overwhelm of how much you're on their mind. Here's what's actually happening inside the avoidant when they're being distant and cold, and why this behavior reveals you're consuming their thoughts even as they push you away. The distance is their attempt to manage overwhelming thoughts about you. When the avoidant acts distant and cold, it's often because they're having constant intrusive thoughts about you, and the distance is their attempt to manage that mental overwhelm. They think about conversations you had. They replay moments together. They imagine scenarios with you. They wonder what you're doing, who you're with, whether you're thinking about them. This constant mental presence of you is overwhelming to someone who needs to feel in control of their inner world. The overwhelm happens because thinking about you triggers feelings the avoidant doesn't know how to process. Every thought of you comes with emotional activation, desire, longing, fear, anxiety about vulnerability. These feelings are intolerable to the avoidant's nervous system, so they try to create external distance to reduce the internal noise. But the distance doesn't actually stop the thoughts. It just creates a false sense of control while they continue being mentally consumed by you. The coldness is also a performance meant to convince themselves they don't care as much as they do. If they act unbothered, maybe they can become unbothered. If they perform indifference, maybe the indifference will become real. But underneath the performance, they're thinking about you obsessively, and the coldness is their attempt to suppress or deny the intensity of those thoughts and the feelings that come with them. This dynamic explains why avoidants can seem most distant right after moments of closeness. The closeness created thoughts and feelings that won't stop, and the overwhelm of those persistent thoughts drives them to create cold distance as a counterbalance. They're not distant because you don't matter. They're distant because you matter too much and they can't handle the mental space you're occupying. They're analyzing every interaction you had in exhaustive detail. When the avoidant is being distant and cold, they're often mentally reviewing every interaction with you, analyzing what you said, what they said, what it meant, what you might have meant. This obsessive analysis happens because you matter enough that every detail feels significant. They replay conversations looking for subtext. They examine your tone, your words, your body language for information about how you feel and what you want from them. The analysis also includes harsh self-criticism about their own behavior. They think about moments they were vulnerable and cringe. They replay times they showed they cared and feel exposed. They analyze their own responses and wonder if they revealed too much, if they came across as too interested, if they gave you too much power. This self-examination is exhausting and creates more distance as they try to re-establish control over their presentation. The mental replay also extends to imagining different versions of interactions. What if they'd said something different? What if they'd been warmer or colder? What if they'd been more or less available? They run alternate scenarios trying to figure out the optimal way to engage with you that would get their needs met while maintaining their defended position. This constant mental strategizing reveals you're dominating their thought space even when they seem checked out. The obsessive analysis creates a feedback loop where thinking about you leads to more thinking about you. Each analyzed interaction raises new questions that require more analysis. Each imagined scenario creates more scenarios to imagine. The avoidant gets trapped in their own head thinking about you nonstop, and the only way they know to cope is to create more external distance, which ironically gives them more time alone with their thoughts of you. They're fighting the urge to reach out constantly. The distant, cold behavior is often the avoidant actively resisting a constant urge to contact you. They want to text you, they want to call you, they want to see you, but they fight these urges because acting on them would mean admitting how much they're thinking about you, how much they care, how much they want connection. So they stay distant while internally battling the impulse to close that distance. The constant fight against reaching out is mentally exhausting. The avoidant has to talk themselves out of contacting you multiple times a day. They draft messages they don't send. They pick up their phone and put it back down. They imagine conversations with you but don't initiate them. This ongoing internal struggle keeps you at the forefront of their mind even as they maintain external silence. The urges to reach out also intensify at specific times. Late at night when defenses are down. When something happens they want to share with you. When they're lonely or struggling. When they see something that reminds them of you. These moments of intensified desire to connect make them double down on distance to compensate. The colder they act, often the more they're fighting the urge to be close. This dynamic creates a situation where you're getting their coldest behavior precisely when they want you most. The distance is inversely proportional to their desire. The times they seem most checked out are the times they're most actively managing their constant thoughts about you and suppressing their desire to reach out. The coldness is evidence of their struggle, not their indifference. They're monitoring you even while seeming disengaged. When avoidants act distant, they're often closely monitoring everything about you while pretending not to care. They check your social media. They ask mutual friends about you. They notice changes in your routine, your energy, your availability. They're hyper-aware of you even as they project disinterest. This covert monitoring keeps you constantly in their thoughts because they're actively seeking information about you. The monitoring also includes tracking your responses to their distance. Are you chasing? Are you pulling back? Are you moving on? The avoidant is paying close attention to how you handle their coldness because it informs their next move. This attention to your reactions means they're thinking about you and your dynamic constantly, analyzing every piece of data for meaning. The disconnect between their monitoring behavior and their distant presentation creates internal conflict. They know they're being distant while also being obsessed with you, and this contradiction is uncomfortable. But they can't stop either behavior. They can't stop thinking about you and monitoring you, and they can't drop the distance because the distance is their only way of managing the intensity of their constant thoughts about you. This covert attention also means they notice things you might not realize they notice. Small changes in your demeanor, new people in your life, shifts in your energy. The avoidant's cold exterior hides a mind that's cataloging every detail about you because you're occupying their mental space nonstop even as they pretend you're not. They're experiencing anxiety about losing you. The distant and cold behavior often masks intense anxiety about losing you. The avoidant thinks about you constantly, partly because they're worried about you leaving, moving on, finding someone else, giving up on them. This anxiety keeps you in their thoughts nonstop, and the distance is their maladaptive way of managing that anxiety while also potentially testing whether you'll stay despite it. The anxiety includes catastrophizing about various loss scenarios. They imagine you dating someone else. They picture you getting fed up with their patterns and walking away. They fear you'll realize you deserve better and act on that realization. These anxious thoughts consume mental space and create more distance as the avoidant tries to brace themselves for loss by preemptively detaching. The worry about losing you also conflicts with their fear of intimacy, creating a painful bind. They're scared of losing you and scared of getting too close. This internal conflict keeps them mentally spinning, thinking about you and the relationship constantly while being paralyzed between their competing fears. The cold distance is their attempt to manage both fears simultaneously by staying connected enough to not lose you while maintaining enough distance to not feel consumed. This anxiety-driven distance explains why avoidants sometimes pull back hardest when they care most. The more they care, the more terrifying potential loss becomes. The more they think about that potential loss, the more distance they create to try to control their vulnerability. But the distance just feeds the anxiety about loss, creating a cycle where thoughts of you intensify as their behavior grows colder. They're trying to convince themselves they don't need you. When the avoidant is being distant and cold, they're often engaged in an internal campaign to convince themselves they don't need you. They tell themselves they're fine alone. They remind themselves of your flaws. They focus on how they managed before you. They're essentially trying to talk themselves out of feelings and thoughts they can't control through sheer willpower. But this campaign requires thinking about you constantly to keep trying to minimize your importance. The self-convincing also involves listing reasons the relationship won't work or why you're not compatible. The avoidant mentally catalogs issues, incompatibilities, reasons to keep distance. But the fact that they're constantly generating these reasons reveals they're constantly thinking about you and the relationship. If you truly didn't matter, they wouldn't need such an active mental campaign to minimize you. This internal narrative also fails repeatedly. The avoidant can't actually convince themselves they don't care or don't need you because the feelings and thoughts persist despite their best efforts. So they double down on external distance as their internal campaign fails, creating colder behavior as their thoughts of you intensify rather than diminish. The irony is that trying not to think about someone makes you think about them more. Every attempt to convince themselves they don't need you requires thinking about you. Every reminder they generate about why they should maintain distance is another thought about you. The avoidant becomes trapped in mental loops where you're constantly present even as they try desperately to make you mentally absent. What this means for how you should interpret their distance. Understanding that the avoidant's distance often means they're thinking about you nonstop should change how you interpret their behavior. Their coldness isn't evidence of indifference, it's evidence of overwhelm. Their seeming detachment isn't lack of care, it's inability to manage how much they care. However, understanding their internal experience doesn't mean you should accept their external behavior. The fact that they're thinking about you constantly while acting cold doesn't make the coldness less hurtful. You're still being treated poorly regardless of what's happening in their head. The interpretation also needs to include recognizing that thoughts without changed behavior are meaningless. The avoidant can think about you nonstop and still treat you terribly. The internal experience doesn't translate to the external engagement you need. Why they're thinking about you doesn't mean they'll act on it. The crucial distinction is that avoidance can think about you constantly, care about you deeply, want you intensely, and still not act on any of those internal experiences. The gap between their internal world and external behavior is often enormous. Thoughts and feelings don't translate to action for avoidance because the action would require vulnerability they can't tolerate. This disconnect also means the avoidant can be consumed by thoughts of you while simultaneously moving on with their life, dating other people, or telling others they're fine and unbothered. The internal experience and external presentation operate on separate tracks. They can obsessively think about you in private while publicly performing indifference or moving forward. The failure to act also reveals that thoughts alone don't change capacity. The avoidant thinking about you nonstop doesn't make them capable of relationship with you. The thoughts might be genuine, the feelings might be real, but without capacity to be vulnerable, to communicate, to show up consistently, those thoughts don't matter. You need someone who can act on their care, not just feel it internally. Understanding this disconnect protects you from being pulled back in by breadcrumbs or occasional moments where their internal experience leaks through. They might reach out sometimes when the thoughts become unbearable. They might show warmth briefly when defenses are down. But these moments don't indicate changed capacity. They're just temporary failures to maintain the distance they'll reimpose shortly. When to walk away, despite their constant thoughts of you. Knowing the avoidant is thinking about you nonstop while acting distant should actually make it easier to walk away. It reveals the fundamental dysfunction of someone whose internal experience and external behavior are completely disconnected. Someone who thinks about you constantly but treats you coldly is not capable of healthy relationship. You should also walk away because waiting for someone's thoughts to translate to changed behavior is a trap. The avoidant might think about you for years while maintaining distance. Time doesn't fix this disconnect. Only therapeutic work does. Most importantly, you deserve someone whose care for you translates to how they treat you. The avoidant's nonstop thoughts about you while acting cold just shows they're trapped in their patterns. Don't get trapped there with them. How their cold behavior protects them from their own intensity. The avoidant's distant and cold behavior serves a crucial protective function against their own internal intensity. When they're thinking about you constantly, experiencing strong feelings, battling urges to reach out, the intensity of their internal world becomes threatening. The coldness is a way to create external calm to balance internal chaos. By acting unbothered, they're trying to regulate a nervous system that's anything but unbothered. This protective coldness also prevents them from revealing how much you affect them. If they acted warm when they felt warm, if they reached out when they wanted to, if they showed care when they felt it, you'd know the power you have over them. And that power feels terrifying to someone whose entire identity is built on not needing anyone. The cold distance protects them from you seeing how much they need you, even though the need is consuming them internally. The behavior also serves to test you. By being cold while thinking about you constantly, they're seeing if you'll stay anyway, if you'll pursue despite the distance, if you care enough to push through their barriers. This testing is maladaptive and hurtful, but it reveals that your response to their coldness is something they're thinking about obsessively. They're cold while desperately hoping you won't leave because of it. The protection through coldness ultimately fails because the distance doesn't actually reduce their thoughts of you or their feelings. It just creates a disconnect between internal and external that becomes its own source of distress. They're cold, you're hurt, but they're still consumed by thoughts of you, and now they're also dealing with guilt, loneliness, and the consequences of their defensive behavior. Why understanding this doesn't mean you should stay. Understanding that the avoidance coldness means they're thinking about you constantly might create sympathy or hope, but it shouldn't make you stay in a dynamic that hurts you. Their internal experience doesn't change the fact that you're being treated poorly. You're still on the receiving end of cold, distant behavior that doesn't meet your needs, regardless of what's happening in their mind. The understanding also shouldn't make you responsible for managing their internal world. It's not your job to decode their distance, to intuit that coldness means care, to stay while they work out how to match their behavior to their feelings. They're adults responsible for their own emotional regulation and behavioral choices. You're not required to tolerate poor treatment because you understand the psychology behind it. Most importantly, understanding their internal state doesn't predict change. They can think about you obsessively for years while maintaining the same cold, distant patterns. Mental preoccupation doesn't equal growth or developing capacity for intimacy. Unless they're in therapy doing real work to align their internal and external worlds, the thoughts will continue and so will the cold distance. Your understanding should actually empower you to leave more easily, because you can see clearly that their issue is internal and not about your worth. Their coldness isn't because you're not enough, it's because their feelings for you are too much for them to handle. This clarity should free you from trying to be better or different to earn warmth, and instead motivate you to find someone capable of warmth naturally. The pattern will repeat until they do the work. The cycle of thinking about you constantly while acting cold and distant will repeat in every relationship the avoidant has until they do deep therapeutic work. This isn't about you or about finding the right person. It's about their nervous system's response to intimacy and their inability to tolerate their own feelings. The next person they care about will trigger the same pattern of internal obsession masked by external coldness. This repetition means that even if you give them space and they come back, even if you try again, the pattern will reemerge the moment intensity builds. They'll think about you constantly, feel overwhelmed by those thoughts, create cold distance to manage the overwhelm. You'll be hurt again by the same dynamic because the underlying wound that creates it hasn't been addressed. The pattern also means that waiting for them to figure things out is futile unless you see evidence of serious therapeutic work. Time alone doesn't fix this. New relationships don't fix this. Even genuinely wanting to be different doesn't fix this without professional intervention. The pattern is too deeply ingrained, too tied to nervous system responses, to change through willpower or relationship experience alone. Understanding the pattern will repeat should inform your choice about whether to stay. Are you willing to be thought about constantly while being treated coldly indefinitely? Are you okay with your worth being held hostage to someone's inability to align their feelings with their behavior? Or do you deserve someone whose care for you is reflected in how they actually treat you? The answer should determine whether you stay caught in this pattern or walk away from it. What happens to avoidants who can't bridge this gap? Avoidants who never learn to bridge the gap between their internal world and external behavior often end up profoundly lonely. They think about people constantly, care deeply, experience strong feelings, but never learn to express those things in ways that create sustainable connection. They lose person after person, not because the feelings aren't there, but because the feelings never translate to the behavior that maintains relationships. These avoidants also often live with significant regret. They think obsessively about people they pushed away, relationships they sabotaged, connections they couldn't sustain. They know they cared, they remember the constant thoughts, but they also recognize their behavior didn't reflect that care, and the distance they created cost them relationships they valued. The chronic loneliness combined with regret can sometimes motivate change later in life, but often it just becomes a source of bitterness. The avoidant might blame others for not being patient enough, for not understanding their struggles, for leaving when they really did care. This externalization of blame prevents growth and ensures the pattern continues. Some avoidants eventually find partners willing to tolerate the disconnect between thoughts and behavior indefinitely. But these relationships are often unsatisfying for both parties. The avoidant gets to stay defended while keeping someone around, but never experiences true intimacy. The partner gets breadcrumbs of the care the avoidant feels internally, but lives in constant uncertainty and emotional scarcity. The only escape from this fate is therapeutic work that helps the avoidant learn to tolerate their own feelings, express themselves vulnerably, and align behavior with internal experience. But until that work happens, they'll continue thinking about people nonstop while driving them away with cold distance, perpetuating a cycle of connection and loss that leaves everyone hurt.